Is it Gero or Gero? Gero?
So, accent and
And
excellent.
yeah, no, it's G's are difficult anyway. Like,
G's are very difficult. If we don't get the G's right, we won't get anything right today.
I'm reading it. Want to give me a 5-minute mark? We'll definitely. Would you like 5 minutes? Mine should be like less than 15 minutes, but if it's 10 minutes, you want to give me a. Of course. We'll give you 1 second to 10 minutes. Just give me like that.
Yeah.
So I know that everybody.
should we agree we'll give everyone 10 minutes? We'll give everyone so you know you've done 10 minutes. I'll throw this pencil.
Are you expecting like 15 minutes?
10 to 15, so yeah.
Use one of those hooks that you have in the theatre to drag people.
I forgot my hook.
Unfortunately, the Murphy's off.
Should we?
Can they sit on the floor?
They can, just we have to make sure no one walks up. Do you
If
guys
you're
want
willing
to
to sit on the floor, you can go over there. For 2 hours, that might be a killer.
After 10 minutes, I'll let everyone know you have 10 minutes, okay? So you have that. But that doesn't mean you have to stop, it just means you have 10 minutes. And then I think we'll come. No, I'm over here. I think there's women should start the rest of it. So maybe we'll wait till she gets back, so you know. Can start? Don't sit over here, sit over there. Like from a replace. Lena's always for one woman to get back, so she doesn't until we had
Hello? Hello? Is this on?
Hello? On?
Yeah. On? On?
She did flick the switch. Shall I use mine? It's on. How many fashion designers does it take to get?
Thank you.
Well, hello and welcome to this, our first FRN New York event. I'm Ellen Sampson and this is Alexis Romano, and we are co-founders and co-chairs of the Fashion Research Network. The Research Network was formed 4.5 years ago when we were both doing PhDs along with our two other colleagues, and both at very, very different institutions. I was at the Royal College of Art, Alexis was at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and we had very different practices. I do research by practice, I'm a maker, my background is design, and you were doing historical research, and we were really interested in the intersections between different forms of fashion research and the ways that our different disciplines might meet together and the conversations that we might be able to have and what might come from sharing different types of knowledge around clothing, dress and fashion. Since then, we've grown. We have about 250 members in the UK. We run 3 or 4 symposiums a year, a reading group, and a range of other events, tours, and archive visits. And we are really, really excited to be here and hope this is going to be the beginning of an ongoing conversation with our colleagues in New York, and that we can ask today, what is fashion research and what might fashion research become? Over to you.
So I think yep, it's okay? Great. Thank you, Ellen. So I just wanted to reaffirm our thanks to FIT Graduate Studies, Fashion Design, for co-organizing this event with us, in particular Ariel Elia, who is in the corner, who is industry and project coordinator of the wonderful new MFA in fashion design that has been created by Jonathan Kyle Farmer, who I'll introduce later as he's one of the panelists, and with the help of Colleen Hill, who I'll also give a proper introduction to shortly, who's curator here. You have both been very supportive and have participated in the FRN in various ways over the past few years. So we're really thrilled that our first event in New York, our first event outside of the UK actually, is here at FIT, which obviously needs no introduction. It has helped shape, I'm sorry, I'm so confused when I get signals. We're going to share.
I've got one now.
Oh, okay.
Number 2
So-
isn't on. Number 2 isn't on.
Number 2, oh, Francesca.
We can edit that out later, right?
Sorry, it's so much for seamless introductions. So FIT, I think, is really the ideal place to ask the question, what is fashion research? So on that note, I think I'll hand over to our wonderful panelists. So we will, each one will give a short presentation on their current research, and then we will open it up for some panel discussion, and then hand over to you to ask some questions. I think that's it. Any other things to? Great. So our first speaker, Anna Reynolds, you're very lucky to have her here. She's only in New York for the year, where she's working on a Polar Weissman Fellowship at the Met, the Costume Institute at the Met. Normally, she's senior curator of paintings at the Royal Collection Trust. Let me just look at my notes. She has curated in fine style, the art of Tudor and Stuart fashion, royal childhood, a royal welcome, and most recently, portrait of the artist. And she also holds an MA in dress history from the Courtauld Institute of Art. So over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much. Is my mic on? I'm going to try and find my slides. Okay, great. So I am going to split my brief talk today into two parts. The first being what I've done in terms of research, fashion research, and the second half about what I'm going to be doing over the next year. It's going to be such a whistle-stop tour, I'm sorry, but hopefully if you have any questions, you'll have a chance to catch up afterwards or ask them in the panel discussion. So for the last 10 years, I've been working at the Royal Collection in London, but that encompasses all the royal palaces that you can think of. So Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle are the most obvious ones, but also all the private residences and places like Hampton Court, Balmoral up in Scotland. And as curator of paintings, I look after the about 8,000 paintings that we have there. But most relevant to today is an exhibition I curated in 2013 or 14. I don't know if anyone managed to see it. It was in London and in Edinburgh. And it focused on Tudor and Stuart fashion. And it really was intended to draw attention to the clothes that we see in portraits and really put fashion at the centre of the exhibition rather than focusing on who the sitters are or who the artists are. It was very much about what they're wearing. So you can see all the advertising, for example, cut off the heads of the figures and really focused in on the details of dress. This is an example of the type of thing that we did for this exhibition. So we would take a Royal Collection painting, like this one of Charles I by Daniel Muytens, and as far as possible, I would try and select very carefully chosen items of clothing from the right period that we could then use to enhance our understanding of the paintings and sort of demonstrate what we can learn from three-dimensional garments that we can't get from paintings and how one informs the other, and really provide a way in for people perhaps that they maybe hadn't considered before. So we would display this doublet. We displayed it in a case in the round so everyone could go all the way around it. We would show on the audio guide what the inside looks like. We would draw attention to things like the seams that you can see here, where every single piece of fabric at this time, because it was so expensive, was kept and used because it was so precious. This is an example of the doublet on display, and this is the book that accompanied the exhibition. And we very much wanted to position the clothes and the paintings in close proximity, so you got these viewpoints from one to the other, and you were asked to think about how they relate to each other. And we really wanted to almost make the items of clothing the star objects in the exhibition, and put them in the centre, and sort of the paintings surrounded them, but we really wanted each one to speak on its own, so we didn't sort of crowd the cases. We gave each one the space to really understand it. This is an example. I'm going to give you just a few examples of the type of research that came out of the preparation for that exhibition. So this is one example. These are two paintings that we now know come from the same. They were cut from the same planks of wood. They're produced by the artist attributed to Scrotts, that is. So this is Elizabeth I as a princess, about 13 years old, and her half-brother Edward, the future 6th of England. And you can see when these were in the conservation studio in preparation for the exhibition, we had a chance to look at them under high magnification. And working very closely with the conservators, we got to understand how artists at this time were using quite experimental techniques in order to try and represent different types of textiles. So in the top left, for example, you can see a high magnification of Elizabeth's dress, her gown there. And we noticed this very, very regular pattern of dots. And the conservator realized that what the artist had actually done was laid down various layers of pigment, and while one of the layers was still wet, pressed into that with a piece of fabric, probably a silk, very tightly woven, to try and give this texture that he wouldn't have been able to create with a paintbrush. And then on the bottom right, you can see the artist here. I don't know if it's just visible. There's a line down, sort of diagonally down Edward's russet gown here. And this actually, under the pigment, the artist put down layers of metal, thin metal leaf, probably maybe silver, maybe gold, and then put the pigments on top of that in order to try and give the impression of a fabric that's been woven with metal threads at the time. So actually using the precious materials that would have been in the fabrics themselves to recreate that in paint. So a very experimental process in the 1540s here. Some other examples of the types of research that needed to be done for this exhibition were looking at portraits to try and understand how we should display the items themselves. So in what sort of shape that the garments would have looked on the figure. So you can see with this buff coat, we had a perspex mount made that very much went out at the waist because it would have been worn over wide men's breeches that would have been padded, and we wanted to give make it look as if it would have actually done on the real model. And we also had to get to grips with how to fix this on a perspex model without damaging the object itself. So for this example, we recreated a string that goes down the eye holes on either side, and then put tiny stitches between that reproduction thread so that you're not actually cutting into the garment itself, but you're able to show as it would have looked at the time. So as well as the catalogue to go with that exhibition, we produced a fashion magazine called Robe, which was a handbag-sized version of the 1660s version of Vogue. And it was actually designed by an ex-Vogue designer, so we very much paid attention to the style of a magazine today. But we wanted it to be very historically accurate as well. So we had Mr. Samuel Pepys answering your style queries, for example. Did you know that Samuel Pepys' father was a tailor? So he was perfectly positioned to answer these questions. And I went through Pepys' diary, which has many, many references to fashion of the 1660s. And I took specific days and examples of things that he did, and I wove those into his Sam's own tips about what you can do, how you can recycle clothing if it gets dirty, for example. So we wanted to make it very historically accurate, but also really fun and relevant to today. Another way that we wanted to make this very relevant was by involving contemporary fashion designers, because we wanted to try and entice a new audience into our galleries, because we have this reputation for being quite stuffy and traditional, and we wanted to try and broaden that out. So the name that kept coming up again and again when I asked people in the fashion world was Gareth Pugh. And so I sent him an email. I sent his people an email and said, is this something that he might possibly want to be involved in? The initial response back was, I'm not quite sure this is Gareth's thing, but I'll ask him. And then the next email said, Gareth would love to be involved. And so I went to Gareth's studio in London, and we talked about his clothes, and he specifically said that this period, the Tudor period, had been a huge influence in his work. The reason he got into fashion design in the first place was through seeing a history magazine with a portrait of Elizabeth I on the front. And you can see how the sorts of shapes of the clothes of that time, the conical farthingales, for example, the waistline of this armour, have been used to inform the types of shapes that he uses in his clothes as well. So we recorded him, we had interviews with him on our multimedia guide, and the ruffs are a very obvious example there, but also about the cut, the use of materials, what he starts with the person or the fabric, and it was really insightful and really sort of made it very, very relevant. So that's what I've done, and that was over the last sort of 10 years. But before that, as Alexis mentioned, I was at the Courtauld and did my master's on John Singer Sargent and fashion. And I am going to be spending the next year here in New York taking that further. It's something that I feel that there was a lot more research to be done on that subject. Back then, I looked specifically at what people are wearing in Sargent's portraits, trying to match up as closely as possible examples of the types of clothing of this time, the late 19th, early 20th century, with Sargent's portraits. I did quite a lot of analytical research, so I established all the different types of dress that women in particular wore at this time. So I came to 14 different categories of clothing, including, for example, here, visiting dress, afternoon dress, tea gown. There's also morning dress, afternoon dress, walking dress, all these different types with very subtle differences. And I found images and sergeants' examples and then extant examples of the same sorts of clothing as well. And then I built a great big database of a certain time period of sergeants' portraits. I took sort of his middle period, and I did lots of graphs of what colours everyone was wearing and what types of clothes were being worn in these different portraits. So that was just one sort of avenue of research at that time, and I feel like there's a lot more that can be done in this area. So I'm going to be asking 4 particular questions in terms of my research. The first one is, what do sergeant sitters wear? So this is very much along the lines of what I've already done, but extending it to include a broader range of portraits, a greater time period, men as well as women. I'm going to be looking at, I'm going to be based at the Costume Institute with their incredible collection of dress from this period, including the Brooklyn costume collection as well as their own. And I'm going to be looking at who the designers were, what sort of features Sargent chooses to emphasize in his portraits and which ones he sort of generalizes or simplifies or overlooks even, which type of fabrics he particularly focuses on. I'm going to be relating it to the Met's portraits as well as the Met's clothing collections as well. So this is just one example I picked just for today. I must say that I have done very little research on this so far because I start on Friday. So this is what I will be doing. But looking at these sorts of things, here's another example of a Worth dress in the Met with a portrait, not identical, but you can see the similarities in terms of the style and the cut and the decoration and the length of the train and all these types of things I'm going to be seeing what Sargent is choosing to focus on. So what do they wear is the first question. The second question is, where did sergeant sitters buy clothing? So this is where being based in New York is fantastic. Hoping to travel up to Boston, but also having a history in London and also having been to Paris a lot as well. I'm sort of looking at all these different areas where sergeant sitters bought their clothes and the fashion cycle and how people moved from New York. Okay, thanks. And sort of through these different areas. And I'm going to be looking at historic maps of the time and looking at where the dressmakers were based and where they relate to artist studios and where they relate to the residences of the sitters themselves and seeing how those all relate to each other. I am going to be looking at how exactly Sargent paints dress, so what techniques he uses. And this is one example. So to paint pearls, he initially starts to paint every pearl individually, but as he gets more accomplished and more fluent and more with greater virtuosity, he paints pearls by a single line of paint with just some white dots, and when you stand back it resolves itself and looks just like a pearl necklace. So looking at these sort of tips or these kind of shortcuts that he does will kind of get my eye in. Here's another example of how he translates a ball gown of that type into just a few strokes of paint that when you stand back it all works. And then I'm going to be also looking at how Sargent's techniques relate to other artists of the time. So here's Baldini, John White Alexander, and then Anders Zorn, just as 3 sort of contemporaries and how they differently approach this question. And then finally, what can we infer about Sargent's own attitudes to dress? So this is looking at what he wears himself, how he chooses to be represented in his portraits and in his photographs, but also what we can tell about his paintings, his watercolours particularly, that weren't commissions, that weren't discussed in conjunction with a patron, that were done for his own pleasure, that were done, what did he particularly pay attention to and how does he represent those elements? A rare glimpse of female leg, for example, here on the left-hand side that you would never actually see in a formal portrait. And then finally, just some examples of caricatures that I've found that Sargent has produced here. So the huge gigot sleeves of the late 19th century, a huge bonnet. And I think this idea that he had a sort of humorous approach to fashion. He saw fashion as had all these fun elements, and then which parts he chooses to sort of emphasize and which he chooses to downplay in his portraits. So I'm going to wrap up there, and if you have any questions, happy to answer them at the end. Okay.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was really interesting to hear you discuss different projects in various stages of completion. So on to our next speaker. Many of you will know Jonathan Kyle Farmer, who has just created this wonderful MFA in fashion design here at FIT. He has, prior to coming here, taught internationally, most recently at Parsons, but also at the University of East London. He has also held education consultancies at the Met in conjunction with the exhibitions Savage Beauty and Impossible Conversations. He has designed, cut, and illustrated for a range of fashion labels, including Bruce Oldfield and Style Site. And he has an MA in fashion women's wear at the Royal College of Art in London. And I think we are almost ready to hear about this wonderful program that
That he can't even get a computer to work.
that is just launched, actually.
Hello? Yes, we're going. Okay, thank you for that amazing introduction. And that's a hard act to follow, I must say. It's overwhelmingly beautiful work that you're looking at, and your translation of that is really inspiring. I can't wait to see what you do. So yeah, hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to FIT, and welcome to this conversation around what is fashion research. So I'm talking about fashion research from a practice-based perspective. This is a presentation I did for the CFDA at their recent education summit, and it was called Practice What You Preach, which I think is a really important thing that we do as educators, is to continue practicing, to bring that work into the classroom, and then what you get from the classroom you bring back into your own work, and it becomes this beautiful sort of washing machine of ideas and translation. So this was a 30-minute presentation I did, so I'm going to reduce it down to 10 minutes. So it's going to be speed talking. So practice, what is that? So one of the things I always really encourage my students to do is try to understand what their idea is before they start to begin the work. What are you trying to get at? What are you trying to do? So this for me became, did I miss a slide? No. This is, I've always been obsessed with the concept of a palindrome, you know, something that reads the same forwards as it does backwards, and applying that to the idea of pattern cutting. So if you look at the body, essentially it is a palindrome in terms of traditional pattern cutting, front, back, side. So I started a body of work called Drawing with Scissors, which literally addressed the idea of the historical way in which fashion design is taught within schools, the draw it, make it system, something that we inherited from the days in which we sent manufacturers would send illustrators to Paris to draw the collections to bring them back to produce clothes through a draw it, make it system. So I'm looking at the idea in which you can draw it, make it, draw it. And the concept of the body as a palindrome. So I started by folding a piece of paper in half and cutting out what resembles a body. It's not really quite a body, but it's close. And then just looking at the internal information inside that palindrome that makes it front, back, side, side. And I developed this concept of a 5D sketchbook as I was doing the work. And I think one of the things I talk about a lot is the being open to seeing what the work can evolve into. So this 5D sketchbook came about by simply the photographing of the work. So if you can see, when I started to light the work, it started to take on a life of its own. And that became the idea of applying a 2D system, a piece of paper, folded in half, which became 3D, photographing it, which became 4D, the shadowing became 5D, and then I take it into a digital space in the next phase, which I'll show you. So this is the idea of a life study of sleeve and hand cut in one. So the other thing I was looking at is where does the body begin and the garment end, and vice versa? And is there an interaction between the two, and what happens in that space? Is there something that can be caught on and explored on in terms of the interaction between the garment and the body? And we're just going to go through some work. So this is one of my first dolls. I call them dolls, and some people don't like them being called dolls. They think it's like not big enough, but I think it's perfectly fine to call them dolls. Nothing wrong with a doll. So literally, it's pattern cutting, and it's drawing, and it's designing, and it's illustrating, and it's styling, all at the same time. But it's all done with a pair of scissors, hence the name Drawing with Scissors, which before I named it, I didn't realize that it was I'd stolen it from Monet or Matisse, but that's okay. So literally the pattern cutting and how that pattern cutting can then be translated into shadows to make an illustration that's being cast by light. And really interesting proportions. But the thing I like about this is because they're about this big, and when I make them, my studio is like something out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's heads everywhere and legs everywhere, and it's not until I put it all together that it becomes a person. But the interesting thing is when you take these pattern pieces that are actual body pieces and arms and legs and skirts and pants and heads, and you put them into a Gerber system or Electra system, and you grade them up and you print them out large scale, they're actually clothes as well. So you can actually wear these illustrations. Just more examples of how the lighting captures different proportions and scales, and how I became more fascinated by the illustration that was the light, actually. This became a really big focus for me. So then bringing it back, this dance between the 2D, 3D, pattern cutting, illustration, design and drawing. So pattern cutting, and I thought about the idea of the palindrome of a tailored jacket, and how we could then manipulate that, and how we could turn that palindrome of a pattern into a pattern itself, and how we could, and so these are all palindromes of jackets. But then I thought about how we could use technologies, 2D, 3D, 5D, projection. How could I then project back onto the body to manipulate the pattern onto an already existing? So all of this is questions that I'm asking. I'm not answering them. That's the process of practice-based research, is actually the exploration of doing. So, doing as research, research doesn't have to live just in a library or in a gallery and looking at other people's work, even though I respect that hugely. But my research is the actual practice of making and seeing what happens when you are open to accidents happening and open to seeing those accidents and observing them and reacting to them. And this is where I took it into a digital space, where I worked with my intern assistant at the time, who was amazing at some of the SketchUp programs and Rhino and all that kind of stuff, which I'm not accomplished with at all. And we digitized them, and then we animated them, and I think this is. We won't do it in the movie. You can watch it on YouTube. But this is, you can see stills from the movie here of how we animated it and how we saw exactly what you're doing in a completely, how do we contextualize something from a 2D space into a 3D space and get people to look all the way around the item. And then this is some of the exhibition photographs from Singapore. So this has traveled the world. As Mary Davis, our dean, says that they're the most well-traveled paper dolls in the world. They've been to Paris, they've been to London, they've been shown in New York, they've been shown in Shanghai, they've been shown in Singapore, and everybody keeps asking me, when are you going to do more? But I need a break from these dolls for a while. But it was a beautifully curated. I worked with someone in Singapore to do this one. But again, it's what you were saying about giving people space to walk around the item and giving it room to breathe, so it takes on a life of its own. So these are just some stills, and I just love the way they sort of elevate and float in space and time. And a friend of mine, Kira's here, who actually wrote an article about my work for my first exhibition in New York, and she wrote something about the fact that it was very religious to sort of have to bend down and have a look at these things in a sort of monastic way, which I was previously going to be a priest a long time ago. That's a whole other story. And it wasn't designed that way at all. It was literally because I couldn't get tall enough plinths. But the interesting thing is how that she translated it, and that became a thing. It's like, oh my God, I didn't recognize that this is something that's in me, and I present it in that way as well. So this thing that's inside you comes out in your work no matter what. So just some more pictures here. And my latest one was the latest exhibition was in Paris as part of a Architects of Paper exhibition. And the interesting thing about these papers, they're all used for architectural sort of displays for Premier Vision and places like that. And all of these displays were really, really massive. And all of a sudden you walk around the corner and there's this little glass on the floor and this tiny little doll floating in space next to these giant installations. And that scale, even for me, was like, what? I didn't, just that kind of contrast was really fascinating. Anyway, the bit that I think is more important is how I teach this, how I preach it. And again, this is some work from, so the MFA program is only just launched. There's some of my students here right now. Welcome. And they're the first cohort of 15 students we have. And so I was teaching BFA classes, and I was just telling somebody this story that I've not taught at bachelor's level for some years now. I've been teaching at master's level. So I was a little nervous to go back into that sort of sophomore level of teaching. But I found that I taught exactly the same way, and the work that they produced was almost of an MFA level quality, even though that they were sophomore. And I think that was a really interesting moment for me to realize that it doesn't matter. You just teach the way you teach, and if they respond the way it was a very interesting place for me to look, and that's something I'm looking at in my own research now. So this was all about the way in which the student had interpreted it. She did all this research around color and the way in which young children, young adults, and elderly people related to colors from a synesthetic perspective. So she started doing drawing with scissors with transparencies and lighting them. And then this is how they then translated into initial design ideas into the Make It Big system. So went from a very small 2D, 3D into a large synesthetic actual clothing, which again, I think you'll find nothing like my work, but that interpretation is really fascinating, how they owned it, which is really important. Last thing I want is to do the same that I do it, because then they're going to steal my jobs. So they must own it. They must take it into their own space. And this is another student that was obsessed with the concept of tents and the fact that tent wasn't a tent without a tent pole. And I was just like, oh my God, you don't even think of those things, you know, and that's so beautiful. So I said, what happens if the body is the tent pole? Okay, 5 minutes, all right, and we're nearly done actually. The body is the tent pole, and what if we remove the body and the garment doesn't exist without the body, and so on and so forth, the relationship with the body, the garment. And then we did all this, her version of drawing with scissors, and then how then she started to drape with those things in the relationship between the tent pole as the body, the frame, the boning, the construction details, and then how that then gets tented. Again, very process-driven, you know, exploration through play, through making. And then the last one I'm going to talk to you about is this one called Blank, and it was about the development, which she spelt wrong, I just noticed. I have to go back and change her grade. But the relationship between the bits, you know, so you do get that influence on them, and they make it their own. But I think what was really exciting is about how they then took this drawing with scissors idea and took it into a space that this was called, like I said, the Blank, and then it turned into this sort of which, you know, is nothing like what I do. But that sort of ownership and the self-application of your own ideas, your own life, your own experiences, and how that then comes out in your work. And that was my little plug for FIT. I'll move on from that. And that's a thank you. Questions, comments at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was really fascinating, and I think it was really interesting for us as an organisation who are very interested in the relationships between more theoretical research, historical research, and practice-based research to think about how these things come together, and particularly in how they come together in terms of education and inspiring new designers and new researchers. We're delighted to introduce Francesca Granata, who is the director of the MA in Fashion Studies and assistant professor in the School of Art and Design and Theory at Parsons School of Design. That's a really long title. Her research focuses on 20th century contemporary visual and material culture, with a particular focus on fashion history and theories around gender and performance studies. Her amazing new book, Experimental Fashion, Performance Art, Carnival and the Grotesque Body, came out last year, and I very much recommend people take a look at it.
Sorry, guys.
And Francesca is founder and editor of the non-profit journal Fashion Projects, and holds a PhD from Central St Martin's in London.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. But to the Fashion Research Network, I was kind enough to host a book lunch for me in London, and to FIT. So I will actually present on a work that I researched and already completed. My book, which is on screen, is a study of the grotesque in fashion design at the turn of the 21st century. It draws on Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian scholar's theories, investigates the reasons behind the proliferation of grotesque imagery within fashion at the period. A constant transgression, merging and exceeding of borders constitutes one of the central attributes of the grotesque. In one of his best-known work, Rabelais' Word, Bakhtin traces a struggle between the classical and grotesque concepts of the body in the West, which he argues can be observed in a number of different areas, including the canon of behavior, the history of dance and fashion. And in my research and now finished project, I took on this unrealized project of Bakhtin in part, and I explored how this struggle was played out at the end of the previous century in fashion. My argument is the 80s were the years which planted the seeds for the more forceful break with classical fashion imaginary that occurred in the 90s. A break whose ripples continue to make their effect felt in the new millennium. And I will show you the slides I don't really have time to go into detail, so hopefully they will be somewhat self-explanatory. The book examines the reason beyond a proliferation of bodies out of bounds in fashion starting in the 80s. Why is it, and he asks the question, why is that during this period, the sealed and perfect body of high fashion is challenged by fashion practitioners? I argue that the bodies and subjects circulating within experimental fashion at the turn of the millennium are undisciplined ones that upset gender and body norms and rules of propriety and beauty. They can be read as provocations and attempt to escape what Foucault referred to as the anatomopolitics of the human body, so the discipline and optimal management and self-management of the body. In part achieved, of course, through health regimes, fitness, but also fashion. So I view fashion in its mainstream variety on a continuum with a number of these technologies of the self at work in neoliberal societies. I argue that fashion could be seen in line with discourse of health and fitness, promoting healthy and normative bodies and subjects, a process that began to intensify in the 80s. And on screen you see a photo of Lisa Lyon, who was one of the first female bodybuilders, as well as a photo of Georgina Gottlieb's work from the mid to late 80s. So it is my argument that in the 80s we begin to witness also a proliferation of grotesque imagery and bodies out of bounds, and this should be understood as a critique towards these normative discourses. I argue that the shift was particularly evident within experimental fashion, and it was influenced by feminism's desire to open up and question gender and body norms, and particularly the normative bodies of fashion. It was also tied, of course, to the AIDS epidemic. Experimental fashion often mediated the fears of contagion and the obsessive moral policing of bodily borders that characterized the 80s and part of the 90s, and cannot be read separately from the powerful discourses of contagion, bodies, and health surrounding the AIDS crisis. So in other words, my argument is that fashion was central to the visual and material culture of those decades, and it played an important role alongside performance, visual arts, dance, film, photography, in teasing through the political and social issues that characterized those decades. So throughout the book, I argue that fashion should be interpreted in par with aspects of visual and material culture as a constitutive and influential part of culture, as opposed to simply reflecting a culture that gets made elsewhere. So it's not really just like the hemlines are shorter because it reflects a political shift, but it actually, fashion constitutes also and makes these political shifts happen. Just getting to the methodology aspect, which is probably what's of greater interest to this panel. Oh, this is a photo of Cindy Sherman, work for Comme des Garçons. So I also did my research primarily at the Met, where I was a Polaire Vice. I don't remember the name of the fellowship, but that's the fellowship we had. It was a great year, and as perhaps is not obvious from the kind of work I do, my research is started with closed object-based research, and that was my primary methodology, as well as a close study of images, primarily moving images, which were created and produced by designer in lieu or in addition to fashion shows. So object-based research was, of course, central to my project and was employed as a way to build and test theories against example of actual garments and accessories. For instance, a close examination of the work I discussed was in fact necessary to unveil the garment's construction technique, which are often hard to ascertain from photographs where you don't see, obviously, the inside of a garment. And for instance, in this instance, I looked at Rei Kawakubo's collection, well-known collection from 1997, to see how the construction articulated a kind of different body shape, to what extent it created a pregnant body shape, to what extent it did not. And I examined, photographed, measured, and whenever possible, handled surviving garments in a range of archives. These were particularly interesting garments to look at and kind of handle firsthand this enlarged collection by Margiela from the late 90s, early O's. And my research was done at the Met, but also the Mode Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as Nicola Bari's own archive. And it was based, of course, on methods by Jules Brown and Valerie Steele's application of them to fashion. Another important methodology was, in my research, was a close studies of moving images, so which started with the techniques of video and filmmaking, but also a close analysis, of course, of the mise-en-scène. Since my work engaged with near contemporary fashion, so we'd start with a lot of at a time when videos and films were produced concomitantly with the garments. In fact, I think as fashion shows become more prominent, some designers not only stage increasingly elaborate shows, but they often produce films and videos to go with them, and the fashion show itself became a recorded event, primarily to be circulated as moving image. And of course, the mise-en-scène is highly important in examining a fashion videos or fashion films where there's hardly any narrative, right? They're primarily non-narratives, and so the mise-en-scène is the most important aspects of the piece. So the mise-en-scène, of course, includes garments and makeup. To a lesser extent, my methodology involved oral history, and I interviewed, whenever possible, practitioners or their surviving collaborators. What I found interesting in the research was how, even though I was looking near contemporary fashion, it wasn't necessarily particularly well documented, particularly in the case, especially in the case of smaller designers like Godley or Lee Bowery. And the book drew, of course, on a number of theoretical approaches. I approached theory as a kind of toolbox. I took a psychoanalytical approach, discussing the grotesque using Freudian concepts of the repressed and of the unconscious. I used an approach developed within gender studies, discussing the grotesque in relation to feminine subjectivity, the maternal performativity, and I borrowed from anthropology, particularly cultural and medical anthropology, to look at a range of designers and the use of certain inversions and other imagery. It also employed theories from cultural history and performance studies. Of course, this in addition to this kind of more formal approach, formal analysis, if you want to so call it, being object-based research, as well as kind of the stylistic study of film and video material. And it's my argument that this combination of approach and method is quite important to fashion research, and as it integrates kind of empirical work which characterized earlier dress studies with theorized and multidisciplinary approaches. And as Christopher Brewer suggests, and many scholars have since put into practice, close object analysis is helpful, and in the case of my project was essential in providing a base onto which a range of theories are applied.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I think there's something really striking about thinking about these relationships between the body and the garment, which keep coming up again and again. We're now delighted to present Colleen Hill, who is curator of costume and accessories at the museum here at Fashion Institute Technology. She has an MA in Fashion and Textile Studies from FIT, and since joining FIT 11 years ago, has co-curated 10 exhibitions, including most recently Paris Refashioned, Fairy Tale Fashion, and Exposed, A History of Lingerie. She has published a book on sustainable fashion with Bloomsbury, and 4 more books with Yale University Press.
Thank you, Ellen. Hello, everyone. I'll be talking about 3 exhibitions today, 2 from the recent past and 1 that's upcoming. And of course, for time reasons, I won't be able to get too much into them. But I wanted to start with this exhibition from just last year called Fairy Tale Fashion, which is one of my favorites, both as far as the research went and also the end result. And in this instance, I wanted to talk a little bit about inspiration. The idea of fairy tale fashion was something that had come to mind a few times, but really had no definitive purpose or means of moving forward. And it was really when this Dolce & Gabbana collection was released and I saw photos of it online sort of immediately afterward. I was talking to my husband like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to do this fairy tale fashion show using objects from this fairy tale collection? I ended up using 4, including these 2 in the exhibition. But lucky enough for me, the next day I ended up meeting with our director, Valerie Steele, and she said, so do you have any ideas for a special exhibition? And I said, yeah, I want to do this fairy tale fashion thing. And in Valerie's way, she was super enthusiastic and said, yeah, you have to do it. And of course, I had no idea how to actually do it still. So what I did was immediately go to some of the early classic written fairy tales. And by some chance, because I had no idea of the history of written fairy tales, I first started looking at a book by Charles Perrault, who is really the first important author of fairy tales. And I was reading his version of Sleeping Beauty, and Perrault was a member of the French aristocracy. He had a lot of ties to the court, and so he makes a lot of references to aristocratic living in his work. And one of the things he points out in Sleeping Beauty is that, of course, Sleeping Beauty has been asleep for 100 years. The prince wakes her up and he thinks to himself, well, she's really beautiful, but she's wearing this really old-fashioned dress, like something my grandmother would wear. And I thought, okay, this is it. I have to base this show on the actual literary tales and really take their references to dress and go from there. So I've included this beautiful illustration by Arthur Rackham of Sleeping Beauty. Perrault actually specifically mentions Sleeping Beauty wearing a standing collar, probably something like a ruff. And then I started diving into theorists and historians of fairy tales, because for anyone who considers himself a fashion historian, it's a very frustrating thing when someone who doesn't know your genre of work kind of thinks they do. So what I wanted to do was make sure that I was pretty well versed in what these really fantastic scholars have released on the history of these stories. Marina Warner actually calls herself a mythographer, which I think is a fantastic job title. And Jack Zipes is someone who I kind of refer to as the Valerie Steele of fairy tales. He's extremely well published. I had a great interaction with him early on where I found a fake Grimm Brothers story that was just this strange little website. It was all printed out, and I thought, this is really weird. I've never seen this story anywhere else. I don't know if it's real, but it's a really cool story and has good references. So I ended up emailing Jack Zipes, and he emailed me back right away, and he said, the person who wrote this is either a charlatan or a fool. And I thought, okay, I love this man. So he was kind of my go-to for fairy tale history. And then I started to really immerse myself in the imagery, particularly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There were a number of really fantastic fairy tale illustrators, some of whom are not so well known today, but others like Arthur Rackham and Edmund de Locke are still very well known. So kind of familiarizing myself with this visual language of fairy tales, which I thought was very important. And then finally, to kind of tie all that together, moving into how fashion has portrayed fairy tales in various ways, including some important editorials. So I was lucky enough to be able to include this beautiful photograph in the book that corresponds to the exhibition. I was not allowed to use this one, but I love it anyway. And this is an Annie Leibovitz photo, and that is, of course, Stephen Jones portraying the Mad Hatter and Christian Lacroix as the March Hare. So since I don't have too much time, I'll kind of fly through how I ended up doing this show. Because fairy tales are not usually set in a specific place or time, I felt I could be pretty fluid with using both historic and contemporary garments. Some of these were really straightforward, as you can imagine. However, Little Red Riding Hood, if you look at very early translations, is usually Little Red Riding Cap. And I think we start to think of her wearing this cloak-like garment when this actually became a fashionable garment. So it kind of evolves as the story evolves and as fashion moves forward. And we got this fantastic Comme des Garçons ensemble specifically for the exhibition. It's now part of our permanent collection. And this is just a quick slide of how everything looked in situ within the installation, which had this beautiful fairy tale-like feel with these scrims. Beauty and the Beast was a very fun story for me because this one did have a little bit more of a time period. A lot of these stories that we're familiar with existed in oral tradition and then over time were written down. They vary according to culture, but Beauty and the Beast was written during the 18th century. It's kind of a conglomeration of a number of stories. So I ended up dressing Beauty and the Beast in court dress because, of course, the Beast was a prince in beast's disguise. And I wanted to portray these ideas in various ways. So sometimes I showed concepts through clothing, other times I portrayed characters through clothing. I really just wanted an excuse to use these Christian Louboutin pumps in any way I could, so this worked out well. And then this is the full effect. As you can see, I've included the Beast there wearing his regal attire, and we created this really fantastic paper mask. The Beast in the story is never really described other than he's hideous and scary. So usually he's shown as myriad animals, but he has a beast's head and paws, but he's usually standing upright and wearing clothing. Rapunzel was a really kind of fun, straightforward one. In the show, we literally had these two pieces. This hair curtain, which is really quite a floor-to-ceiling piece, and this McQueen dress, which was actually part of a collection about witches, which works very well with the idea of the sorceress or the witch who traps Rapunzel in the tower. Snow White was another fun one. This story is actually much more complicated than most of us recall from the Disney version, in that the stepmother tries to kill Snow White 3 times. The first time is through lacing her corset or her stays too tightly, which is why I've included this Dolce corset dress. The second time is using a poisoned comb. Poor Snow White is not very smart, so she keeps getting tricked. And then the third time is through the poisoned apple, which I've included in the Judith Lever Minaudière here. And this was the effect as it was on the platform. We had a little Snow White in a faux coffin, and then we also represented the stepmother with this great Rick Owens ensemble that happened to have this comb hairpiece. And there is the book, which lovely Ellen also contributed to, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about using books as a way to pour a lot more research into things. Paris Refashioned was just this year. It just closed in April. And this was a show that I had been thinking about for some time for a couple of reasons. One of which was because I did my master's thesis on the impact of Sylvie Vartan and Françoise Hardy on fashion in France during the 60s. And so I expanded my research quite a bit for this exhibition, but really specifically wanted to focus on the fact that the Museum at FIT collection has really wonderful pieces from this time period. So this was in our special exhibitions gallery, but it was using only MFIT pieces. I started in '57 because that's when Saint Laurent takes over at the House of Dior. This is a piece from his first collection for Dior. We have things like a first season André Courrèges suit. Also some fantastic ready-to-wear. And what I really wanted to do here was juxtapose French couture and ready-to-wear. Ready-to-wear was really coming into its own in France during this time period with people like Ricky Allen and Emmanuel Kahn leading the way. This is the introductory room. This was 1957 to circa 60, all couture, so it had a very different feel. It was kind of sedated and quiet, and the pieces, of course, were very high-end. And then as we went into the main gallery, I mixed up the couture and the ready-to-wear, and it had a much more colorful 60s vibe to it. I did indicate on the labels what was ready-to-wear and what was couture, but I didn't want to make that distinction in the way that I actually positioned the objects. And this is just getting back to the idea of how we do research. For me, I'm a very old-fashioned researcher. I like to do all of my research myself rather than ask someone else to help, because I just have to have it all in my head. And I like to flip through magazines, even though it takes forever. And sometimes that really pays off. So for example, one of my favorite films from this period is Masculin Féminin. Chantal Goya here is wearing a Daniel Echter ensemble. I had no idea. I just stumbled upon this in Elle magazine. I didn't know it was red. I didn't know much about it at all. And as you can see, you can buy the ensemble with your own initials, and you can see that Chantal is definitely wearing her own clothing, which is something I'd always thought she was doing in the film, because she has a C on her pocket and a G on her scarf. And again, here's a book that Alexis contributed to, as well as Emma McClendon, who's here in the audience. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about publications as furthering research for an exhibition. And this is my current work, which is in progress. It's for an exhibition that will open in May. It's called Fashion Unraveled. And this is also a permanent collection exhibition that will be showing things that either haven't been shown before or that I'm showing in a very different way than we've shown them before. So I have a few categories in the show. And it begins with clothing that has been significantly mended or altered. Some of these you would never know. We've shown this beautiful Schiaparelli suit before. We don't talk about the ways that it has been mucked with, as we say. So I've included some detail shots here. The wearer was actually a Vogue editor, but she altered the skirt's waistband. She altered the hem a couple of times. You can see some repairs inside the jacket. So this is the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about. Is kind of behind the scenes look at objects in many museum collections. They're very rarely perfect. This is a great gown from circa 1840. This is an idea that I'm kind of obsessed with, which is turning 18th century gowns into 19th century gowns. And this example is extra special because, as you can see, we have the original sleeve ruffles. It's very rare that these pieces come with their old components still part of them. And this bodice was literally turned back to front. You can kind of get a good sense looking at it what's happened to it. And then this is another very interesting piece. As you can see, we've dressed it. It kind of looks like a normal bustle gown. And then you look closely, and for whatever reason, it's never actually been finished. So there's a lot of speculation involved in this, but it also is very much just based on solid, old-fashioned object research. And then I'm kind of ending these ideas of mending and repurposing and unfinished garments with the idea of deconstruction. So these very intentional modes of representation here represented by a Bernard Wilhelm piece, but I'll also have Comme des Garçons, Margiela, the kind of usual suspects with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. That was very fascinating and very interesting to have that inside privileged peek at exhibitions that I think many of us have seen, and also for articulating so well that moment between having an idea and having nothing else, which I'm sure we've all been there before. So our final panelist is Cassandra Giraud, who is Assistant Conservator at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Arts. Her main focus is preparing objects for interdepartmental and outgoing loans, and I believe she's going to be talking about a particularly fascinating garment and loan for you today. Prior to that, she worked in the collections department at the Costume Institute and at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum of Design. And like Colleen, she holds an MA in Fashion and Textile Studies, History Theory, Museum Practice from right here at FIT. So, go ahead,
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about a project I did a couple years ago. It was, well, as a conservator, my research is generally object-based, and it's usually for very practical reasons. So you'll see through this example, everything I was doing was very practical. I had a very, distinct goal, and I had to make it there. So in 2011, the Costume Institute put on this exhibition, Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty, and in 2015, the V&A Museum in London decided to put on their own version of it. And they asked to borrow the razor clam dress on the right up here, and which means we would have to ship it there. So we said, "Are you sure?" And they said yes. So this dress has approximately 1,200 razor clam shells attached to it, and it's attached to the dress fabric with monofilament. And the shells are fragile, and they are heavy, and they clang around, and they crash into each other, and they fall off the dress because the monofilament fails. So it's very challenging to deal with. So our challenge here was, how are we going to safely ship this to the V&A and install it in a way that it's not going to fall apart, and that it also still looks beautiful, because we have to fulfill the curator's vision and the artist's intent. So it has to be safe and it has to be beautiful. So I started my research just looking at the documentation that we have at the museum. And so in looking through our database, I found these photos, which wasn't a huge part of my research, but I thought I'd share it because it's kind of a fun photo. So on the left is the image as it appeared in the catalog, and on the right is the image before retouching. So obviously this was taken before the object was accessioned into our collection, because we don't allow live models to wear our dresses. But I thought it was kind of a fun thing that you find looking through your records, and also a reminder that when you're looking at the object, if you find white stuff on the inside, you remember, oh yeah, it's body paint. Okay, so I decided it was time to look at the dress. And So this is our object-based research here. And I was looking at materials and construction. You can see there's a muslin bodice. The skirt is organza. There's 2 zippers in the back, and the shells are sewn on in diagonal lines. I looked at the size, took some measurements. We need to know, what size the mannequin needs to be, and this is very small, so we knew that we would have to chop down a mannequin, cut the boobs off, cut on, so that we had to cut her neck. Even the neck was too big for this dress. It's very small. So it's very important to get the right size. I looked for previous repairs and conservation. I noticed some of the shells had been sewn on with white thread instead of monofilament, which I think were repairs. And the biggest thing I was looking at is what's the condition? Is it sturdy enough to travel? Is it sturdy enough to go on display for a few months? And does it need treatment? Is it visually appealing? Does it have any other special needs? And it's actually kind of hard to answer these questions just looking at it flat. I really needed to get it on a form to find out exactly what was going on. So we decided to do a test dress. And it actually took 5 of us. So once we got it on the mannequin just as a test, we realized, okay, we can't do this at the install. We can't expect the V&A to provide 4 additional couriers to help me dress this dress. So we decided we would ship it on the form, which would make installation easier, but packing really a lot harder. I'll get to that a little bit later. But once it was on the mannequin, it was a lot easier to see what was going on and to see how the shells react to gravity and movement, how well they were attached. And I was also able to see that there are 2 big bald spots on each hip. And I wasn't really sure what caused these bald spots because it doesn't seem like an obvious place where the shells would break off. But I did a little research, and I found that in the runway show, this was in 2001, the Voss runway collection by Alexander McQueen, the model was instructed to break the shells and rip them off the dress because the theme was an insane asylum. And this show is on YouTube. You should look it up. It's a great show. But that explained a lot of the breakage that we had on the shells up here and the bald spots here, because you can see her in that video, just grab them, and you can see them on the floor. So that was a little extra information. It was good. And because of these bald spots, and because I was really worried that when we shipped the dress, all the shells would just break off, I really wanted to make sure that I had a lot of replacement shells when I went to go and install it. So we contacted the design house to see if they had any extras and also to see if they had any information on how the shells were treated. Because if you see a regular razor clam shell, they're not this color, they're much darker. So we knew that we knew from our records they had been stripped and varnished, and of course they had holes drilled in them so they could be attached, but we didn't know any of the specifics, so for us to try to replicate that would have been, impossible. So while we were waiting to hear back, I also contacted restaurants and seafood shops. And turns out razor clams are only available during drain tides, which are certain times of the month. And I thought that was very interesting and not something I would really expect to learn in fashion research, but now I know. But anyway, none of this really worked out. McQueen, they didn't have any extra shells, they didn't have the information, so I really had to pivot and come up with a new idea. And so I decided to make reproduction shells out of paper. So if you look, the real shells are on the right, and my reproductions are on the left. So I think they came out pretty good. So I just took pictures of the shells and printed them on photo paper, cut them out, and curved them, so that worked out. So I had one problem solved at least. So after the test fit, we took the dress off, we cut the mannequin down to the right size, we redressed it, all 5 of us again, and then it was time to figure out how to pack this. And So first, I talked to our packers in the registrar's department, who are amazing, and we talked about a plan for a crate. And so you can see the finished crate on the right, but the challenge is that the only places we could secure it were the head and the feet, because everything else had shells on it, and arms, aren't really, you can't count on them for stability because they'll just fall off. So the packers would make the crate, but I did the internal packing. So it's lots of tissue and some custom Tyvek and batting pads, and you can see how it turned out there. And another thing we had to think about was the height of the crate, because the mannequin itself is a good 6 feet. So this crate is 92 inches high, which is 7.5 feet high. And because of that, it had to fly on a cargo plane. So it was a really long courier trip. We trucked to JFK. We took an overnight cargo/passenger flight. So of course that flight couldn't just go right to London. It had to go to Amsterdam. So then I had to truck to a ferry and take another overnight trip on the ferry, which I'm pretty sure was the only female on the whole thing, and then finally truck to the V&A.
How long did that take?
It was over 2 days. It took forever, yeah. And when we got to the V&A, the crate was like just short enough to make it through the hallways. Like, we had to move aside a light fixture at one point. It was amazing. But it was successful. So you can see the final product here. And even after we installed it, I kept doing a little more research, and I spoke with my colleagues in conservation at the V&A, and we talked about shipping objects on mannequins, and they do it a lot, mostly on dress forms. And so they were super generous and really shared a lot of tips. And so if we ever have to do this again, I'm going to feel a lot more confident next time. And just to sum up the different types of research I did in this project, we look a lot at our documentation. For conservators, documentation is very important, and the objects, of course, are always the main thing. And object history, like finding out about the runway show, I think of that as a little more curatorial research, but that's always helpful too. And we do a lot of research about treatments and materials, and so it's a lot of different types of research. I threw in the packing there just because that was such a huge part of this project. So it's just, I don't know, it's, I don't know how to sum it up, but basically we gathered a lot of information from a lot of different sources, and then we were able to achieve the challenge that was given us, and the dress was safe and it was beautiful.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. That was very illuminating, and you did a great job of pulling together, I think, a lot of the threads that all of our panelists have brought up today, images and objects, the pull between history and industry, and many more things. So I think we would like to thank, before we get to the second part of the event, we'd like to thank all of our panelists for their fantastic presentations. And we have about 10
minutes.
Right, we have 40 more minutes, but we'll ask you a few questions for the next 10 or 15 minutes and then open it up to the audience. Ellen, would you like to do the honors?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I was very struck, as Alexis said, by these sort of intersections between the materiality of the garments, between the body, between imagery and text. And I suppose one of the first things I'd like to ask all of you is that you all have are engaged in very different forms of practice: curating, teaching, designing, conservation. And I suppose I'd like to know how you see your practices intersecting with writing and the relationship between written fashion research and more practice-based or practical aspects of your roles.
Someone else go, I'm going to fix this.
Well, I think for somebody whose professional life is primarily university, writing, and in a art history program, obviously writing is somewhat the final product,
Absolutely.
generally speaking. For a few people, they might be working curators, but it's quite rare, at least in my department. So I think it was fascinating because I usually speak to an audience that's doesn't do their primary research on object, but books. So I think I obviously had the opposite experience. It was fascinating for me to hear all the different way object-based research is done. Especially the conservation one was really brought it to the next level out into the world with the crates and the cargo ships. But yeah.
Brilliant. Colleen?
I guess for me, writing books is really fun because you end up putting so much research into a project, and we're very strict at the museum about how much text can accompany an object. So the most text we ever get is 50 words. And obviously there's usually a lot more to say or a lot more that you want to contextualize. I have never written a book that isn't based on an exhibition that I've done. So that means I've taken the object-based research, and it really does have to start for me with objects. And then I've expanded upon that a lot. And I think especially for fairy tale fashion, all I could really do in the exhibition was summarize the stories because not all of them were familiar, or people might have been thinking of a different version than I was thinking, and then relate the objects in 50 words or less to those stories. That's it. So I didn't really get to talk about the history of the story or draw in much of the imagery. And so I think being able to look at things in a bit of a broader sense, in a more multidisciplinary sense, is what makes writing so exciting for me.
Writing is really... Is this someone who hit this microphone?
This one works.
Hello, hi. So writing for me has always been the most horrific thing in my entire life. I'm dyslexic, and I've literally hidden from it in a major way all my life. And then I got this job, and I had to write a curriculum. And I was like, oh, that's what this job is, okay. So I had 10 weeks to design 21 courses, and I had to write them, develop them, research them. But the one thing that I think I like to talk about is that your life is your research as well, and applying your life experience to your work. And I think for me, the writing became pleasurable when I sat down and reflected on my own practice and my own experiences and the things I've been through as a student, as a designer, as an educator, and how I then sort of put them all together in a curriculum, and then now I'm in a place where I teach it. So something that became really scary, was really scary for me, actually became really pleasurable, and I really enjoyed writing to the point that I'm now making my students write, and it's something that I didn't tell you that. It's in the curriculum. But it's something that when I was a student, they took it out because fashion students and designers are usually very fearful of that space, and it gets in the way of them designing because they spend so much time on the fear of writing. But I realized the value of it all these years later, so it's become quite an interesting sort of cycle for me to look at.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to touch on that as well. I guess related to what Colleen said, the book of an exhibition it has longevity beyond the exhibition, obviously. So it's such a nice sort of legacy of if you didn't get to see it or if you did get to see it. But so that is what's so great about an exhibition catalogue. But then when I think about being a curator, there are so many different forms of communication that you have to translate your research into. So the book is one, and the labels are one, but then the multimedia guide is one, the lectures that you give, the labels, the panels, various different ways of communicating, and always thinking about the level of information that someone's coming to your exhibition already having, and the audience, just sort of that's such an important part, I guess, of what we do, and just sort of being able to translate that into different types of writing. It's something that I was very aware of and have learned to do as I've gone along, I think.
And just one thing about conservation writing, I think for us, if we do our job well, it's basically invisible. And so it helps if when conservators do treatments or do things that they put a lot of work into, if they share it, it's very helpful to everyone else, because then we don't have to start from zero and reinvent the wheel. Maybe somebody did something similar and we can adapt it to what we have to do. So in a way, that's very helpful.
Thank you. And I was also, just to kind of follow up on that, writing is also could be a form of research in a way. Have you ever found that the process of writing has changed the rest of your research? Have you had to go back and rethink things as you...
I think through my research as I write it, like I took, I don't know how you did it, but how everybody does it, but I do research and then I don't really write until I have a body of research, so it just comes through writing a lot of the meanings that I make. It's a little bit intuitive. I'm curious how other people put their research into writing.
I over-research everything, and then I start to write and try to do that really quickly. But I think where writing helps me is no matter how much you over-research, you always miss something. So you come to a point where you don't have a segue, or there's something that's missing and you're going from A to D and you need B and C. So I think that's where writing can really inform my research. But typically I spend way too much time on research and should focus more on writing, I think.
Thank you. I guess on this idea of fluidity between writing and other kinds of research, we were really curious to hear your ideas on how your research practice intersects with other disciplines. Disciplines that relate to fashion or anything else. And you've all talked about that already, but is there something that you could add to that particular question?
I guess the main thing for me, is the main people I work most closely with are the conservators. And being a paintings curator, I work closely with our paintings conservators. And just the interplay between looking very, very closely with them under an optovisor, under a magnifying glass, looking at the paint samples, cross-sections, and asking each other the questions that will then push our research further. They need curatorial information, historical information about how the painting looked, photographs of a painting at many years in the past, and I need their technical expertise, and so that's hugely important. Like I couldn't have done the exhibition I did without very, very close cooperation with our conservation team, and I think that works in terms of textile conservation as well as paintings as well. So that's the main one for me.
I think from an education perspective, I think there's two main areas that I sort of intersect with in my own practice, which is my students first and foremost, and then of course industry, and how those three things sort of work with each other and how they influence each other and how they inform each other. I think that would be the most, where things most cross over outside of the realm of fashion, because my students are doing work around interior design, the students doing work around the concepts of mourning dress and how people dress differently when they're in mourning, so psychology and psychiatry and all that kind of stuff. So to get new fashion, we have to look beyond fashion to get to a new space, and that's what we're trying to do.
Similarly, I think that's what makes researching fashion so hard, that it encompasses so many different disciplines. I think it's almost like overwhelming at times. Like it is object, but it's image, it's still image, it's moving image. So you're looking at, and it's of course like a bodily practice. So people wear fashion, you can look at it as an everyday practice. So it is highly interdisciplinary, and each project is going to draw on different disciplinary approaches. I thought it was interesting how, also for me, when I was doing the object-based research in museum, the collection staff was so helpful in teaching me how to read the garments, and then this incredible knowledge that they were so willing to share. So that was great.
Brilliant. I mean, I think one thing I'm very interested in is that fashion studies or fashion research as a sort of formal taught university subject is still a relatively young discipline, and we all come from quite different areas of fashion studies. But I suppose I'd be interested to know how you see the discipline evolving, what you think the future of fashion studies or fashion research as something which exists within educational institutions might be.
I think this panel says a lot about what the future will be, which is that we all do overlap in some way, even though technically we're working in different areas of fashion. And I think as fashion studies evolves and it becomes a bigger field, it will also all sort of meld together in new and interesting ways. And as Francesca was saying, become increasingly interdisciplinary and accepted as an interdisciplinary practice.
Yeah, from the point of view, for instance, of fashion exhibition, it's been really exciting, but again, fairly overwhelming how much more there is now than even 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's, even if you see at that particular context, it's such a kind of fast growing field. And within university, it's such a fast growing, well, not that fast growing, but it's a growing field. Yeah.
I think it's about bringing fashion studies into the fashion design space as well, and not seeing it as just this project runway culture of, getting inspiration, go and buy some swatches, and then make a dress. Instead, knowing why, having the background, understanding where it comes from, respecting that heritage, and then standing up and saying, I recognize where it comes from, and I respect that, but now I'm going to do it my way. Taking it to that next level, and then that generates the next layer of fashion studies, when the students come in 20 years, there's a reference in your own work, I'm talking about washing machines a lot, but it's a cycle, it's a fashion cycle,
Also, within the museum, we see a lot of other departments wanting to borrow fashion and incorporating that into their exhibitions. And so I think that opens up a whole new audience and creates a lot of new connections. And I think that's really promising. Yeah.
Well, I think these conversations are so important because fashion can mean so many different things, and so it's logical that fashion research can really be anything. And I think it's been important to the Fashion Research Network to constantly have conversations about that kind of challenge what we think fashion is. Shall we?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, are there any questions from the floor?
He's got one. There's one at the back.
So my question is actually for Cassandra. I was wondering if there was anything in your research that made you decide that recovering those blank spots was the appropriate conservatorial choice, and if you ever considered just leaving them blank, and if you could just talk a little bit about your thought process on that.
Yeah, we actually did leave them blank. I printed up a whole bunch of those shells and then decided that we could wait until we got to the V&A and got it installed to see if it was needed. And also, it's a question of whether the curator would want it, because maybe since that is part of the history of the garment, maybe the curator wouldn't want those spots covered up. So I decided just to wait until we got there. And when we got there, the placement of the case was in a way that those bald spots weren't distracting or anything, because that's really what we want to avoid is someone being distracted by a condition issue. When they're looking at a garment, we want them to see how the artist intended it to be, unless there's, another reason. But yeah, so we didn't cover them up because we do tend to try to do the minimal. But we could have if the placement was different and if they were distracting.
That was actually my question to you, actually, because I knew the story before you told it, because I remember the show so well, and it's, I just remember the theatre attached to that. So do you get different types of audiences wanting different types of things? Because I know if I saw, I would have been looking for those spots just to remember, and also maybe seeing the video showing why that happened, how it came to being, and then other people are like, it's not finished. I also love your papers. I think that's amazing.
Thank you. We really take our direction from the curators, and so it depends on how they want to display it. I can imagine if they were showing that dress alongside the video, maybe they would really want to highlight those bald spots or have some broken shells around. So we would just really go with what the curator's vision is.
I love the fact that you call them bald spots. I picture a head, two-headed. Talking about grotesque.
Thanks so much. It's another practical question, really, but it's also a question about audience. For Anna, I was intrigued with Robe, your contemporary version of or whatever it was. I mean, Samuel Pepys as a contemporary fashion critic. But I just wanted to know more about that. Did you actually sell the journal? And also, more to the point, what was the response to it? Speaking again of audience.
Yes, we sold it. It was about £3, so $4, something like that. So compared to the exhibition catalogue, which was about £30, it was a nice memento of the exhibition that was much more affordable to this new type of audience that we were trying to get in. It included lots of objects, as many objects as possible from the exhibition included within the different articles. It was edited by Professor Aileen Ribeiro, who taught me at the Courtauld, and she specifically wrote all the section on beauty, and it included lots of contemporary. It was very much beauty and fashion. So she had a particular eye for accuracy and things being, very historically accurate. So I think that made it more than some other examples of trying to do this, where it has just looked like a token thing that is quite throwaway and doesn't really have much substance. I was actually really proud of it in the end. The same designer, the Vogue designer, did the main catalogue and did Robe as well. So somehow she managed to split her time between the two. And we got great feedback from it. Like we sold out all our copies that we printed. I can't remember. I think it was something like 7,000, something like that, which is pretty good. And we gave it to all the fashion colleges that we worked with, and they have kind of versions to reference as well. So I think it worked really well.
I just want to follow up on Hazel's question about Rome with Anna, because I got really intrigued by how you explained the Mr. Pepys writing. So it sounds like you were taking this sort of primary source, but then it became an act of creative writing.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, were you involved with that writing, or who was doing that writing, and how did you end up sort of synergizing and figuring out where to draw the line between this historical accuracy and this imaginative, new, appealing piece of writing?
Yeah, it's strange because I am not a writer, like a fictional writer in any way. I studied sciences at university, and I have quite a factual, analytical approach to my research. So this was a whole new thing for me to try and sort of be very imaginative. And I was writing it at the same time as I was writing the main catalogue. Sort of, I'd write the main catalogue during the days in the library, and then I'd go home and sit in front of the TV and think, what would Samuel Pepys say in this kind of pop culture version of life that I'm living in now? So I'm ashamed to say quite a lot of Robe was in the evenings when I was sort of on my sofa just thinking, how can I make this relevant? But yeah, I started by going through the diaries, searching an electronic version, so that was a little bit easier for every contemporary 17th century dress word I could think of. So I got all the references pulled up, and I took, there is one particular example where he has I think it's a cloak, and he goes out and he actually poos all over it somehow. He has some kind of diarrhea explosion. And he writes this down in his diary. And then he says, I took this beshit cloak to my father, and then he turned it into breeches. So I took that and said, like, it didn't need much extra imagination to make that into an anecdote that could then be quite, I was careful in my language, but it actually happened. So like, I didn't need too much imagination in that one. And there are other examples as well. So yeah, Pepys is full of wonderful comments like that.
Maybe that's where Lee Bowery got the idea from.
Close connection. Pedagogical reference.
Anyone else?
Hi, I just want to ask a question about researching process, and I know most of you pull out a lot of references and read an object. How do you not get distracted or lost in the middle of the process and still recognize what you're doing, or if you feel the need to change the direction, how do you
$1 million
assess
question.
Yeah.
I'm going to slightly leap in there because I'm so excited to have a year where I can follow those rabbit holes, where in my day job for the last 10 years it's been very much focused on what's the output, what does the exhibition look like, once I've chosen the objects, how does this object relate to the story that I'm telling, and what's the narrative. So I have these 4 questions that I'm going to be working on for the next year, but if one of them turns out to be far more interesting than the others, there's nothing to say that can't become the main focus, and everything else sort of just becomes a side element. And I'm just so excited about that prospect. For me, it's such a treat, really. So
I go down rabbit holes all the time, and I like it. I think for a curator, one of the things you always worry about is not being able to come up with another idea, or another idea that you really like and that you're really passionate about. And for me, I tend to work on numerous exhibitions at once, whether they're actually going to happen or whether they're only happening on paper or in theory. And that's part of the reason that I love doing so much primary research and actually flipping through magazines and getting all of that in my brain, because I think it really helps to inspire. But also when I go down these rabbit holes, I think it's not right for this project, but it's definitely good for this other one. So it's a little bit difficult, but you also learn how to manage your note taking and saving images and balancing these different ideas. So as long as it doesn't go too off the rails, I really like that process.
I guess in my case, it's similar. You start with a research question, a set of research questions, and then you do your research, whatever methodology, your research question might change along the way. But yeah, I did meander quite a lot. That's why it took me so long.
You're also one of my students, so I want you to get lost. I want you to wander into things that you don't know yet, and I think that's what it's all about, right? Stumbling upon the possibilities, the accidental innovations. This semester is all about play, and by playing you will find things that you can focus on next semester. So don't be afraid to get lost, because my job is to bring you back. And it's only 1 week you've done, so I can see you stressing already. We'll talk in class tomorrow.
I do think there is a kind of pressure to outcome that does make it a little less fun. Not less fun, but it's harder to kind of get lost with a certain pressure to productivity, which I'm sure is different, the outcome in museum than university, but it's still.
I think one of the issues with an exhibitions that I work on, for example, is that the object list is determined so far ahead, because we have to think about conservation, a year or 2 years of a painting, and the frame and the lighting and all that. So there's no chance, if you do find something amazing, to just drop it in at the last minute. I don't know if that's the same with any of the exhibitions you've worked on. It's probably very similar. So I'm always slightly nervous of finding that amazing new thing that tells this perfect story that I can't then include. I mean, it can be a comparative in the book, but it's not the same. So I'm sort of, it's that tension between carrying on or not, yeah.
so not at all a criticism, but it does seem like we're missing voices from disciplines like sociology and anthropology, which have contributed a lot to fashion studies largely. And Francesca mentioned this issue of the lived body or the social element of fashion. So I'm just curious how all of you, well, I guess maybe first, that's not my field, neither of those are my field, so that's not an attempt to say I should say something, but I'm curious how you all who are coming from very, very particularly object-focused areas, like how, when we look at fashion studies broadly or fashion research broadly, like how you interact or how you regard those who might start from very large social questions or, anthropological questions or dealing with large groups of people, just how that relationship unfolds in a bigger conversation.
Well, first of all, graduate studies invites would like to invite you to come and talk to us about those things. I mean, or set something up. I mean, these things are all about, sparking ideas and doing the next one. I think you're absolutely right. This is, I feel a bit like on the outside of this conversation myself in a way, because I'm the one that's practicing and making as opposed to objects that are sourced and found and exist and curated. So I think it's definitely something that I would love to pursue in conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Cultural anthropology in particular, perhaps I'm a little more familiar because the persons we have a couple of faculty on it. Well, one is a material culture anthropologist, so probably more in our object camp, but the other one is a cultural anthropologist. But yeah, they've obviously influenced fashion, and it's, as I said, there is so many kind of way of looking at fashion, methodological approach, ethnography being one of them. I'm not really particular fan of quantitative method, but there's so many qualitative methods to approach a study of fashion, object-based research and material culture being the one that we discuss most this time. But that doesn't mean that other methodologies are not as valid. It's just hard to cover them all, I think. And I think it's also hard as a scholar to be, to do ethnography and material culture and film analysis. I think there is also parameters that you have to set up for yourself and areas of expertise, hopefully. I'm not an ethnographer and I don't do ethnography, but it doesn't mean I don't think it's important. I just know what I was trained in and what to do.
Go ahead, Colleen.
Oh, no.
I was going to just jump in and see if Lucy wanted to talk about her. No.
No, I honestly was just curious, it's a challenge, right? Like dealing with the really big questions and the really particular objects. And so I'm just curious when you are, given who's here today, if you all see, if it's a struggle to kind of say, well, gosh, why are these people asking these big questions? It starts with the object, do you feel committed to, at least theoretically, to really starting with these actual things? Because I think that there's something really important. I mean, obviously, extremely, fashion is an object.
But I mean, what the methodology would be kind of, at least the disciplines. I think the methodologies are still, in my mind, also guiding the kind of answers you give to the question. So I think that's a way of anchoring in my research. But I mean, even an ethnographer as a field, they have to limit what it is that they're looking at. And I think part of the research process is you come with a big question and then you realize that even if you're doing a book, you actually have to narrow it down, and narrow it down. I'm sure perhaps an exhibition has a similar method, I don't know. So it's kind of a process of actually narrowing down your question to something that's manageable, also in terms of research and whatever it is, your methods, There is a certain amount of objects, you're going to be able to see a certain amount of films or videos, or a certain amount, ethnography itself is you're going to spend a certain amount of time with a particular population, a particular place. Obviously, the question is also, it tends to be quite a lot smaller once you actually go into your research. That's
perhaps to add to that a little bit, I think that perhaps the material turn in general has meant a lot of us, even those from social sciences, have ended up turning more towards objects and looking more at artifacts, and that there is, even those very large questions seem to be being approached much more through a lens of materiality and the material and specific things at the moment. I don't know if that is the case, but that's generally my sense.
I have a feeling that gender studies is going to be a big question that comes up in my next year's work. I think at the moment I'm in a slight state of blissful ignorance that I don't know what I don't know. So I'm going to see where that leads me, and I am very aware that that's not my area of expertise, and I hope to meet people for whom it is an area of expertise, and I can start to understand that world further and see how that informs questions about bloomers and suffragettes. This is all exactly the time that Sargent's painting still women in languorous poses wearing ball gowns. So there's lots of questions there, and I think that's going to be something that I hope to be able to investigate. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. I feel this feels like a conversation that could carry on for the whole night, and I think that's really brilliant. It's been really amazing to have so many people here and to have such brilliant panelists discussing such interesting work, and I'm really excited about having some more events in New York and meeting more of you.
Yes, I think the last thing that we must do, which I forgot to do in the beginning of the evening, is thank FIT Graduate Studies, and particularly our collaborators, Kyle, Colleen, and Ariel, and of course all of our panelists for their fascinating presentations.
And thank you, Fashion Research Network, very much.
And thank you to the audience for your input. And I forgot to mention, thank you so much, FIT, for providing this buffet. So please grab something on your way out. Or
Something about how we can get involved with fashion?
So if you have signed up via Eventbrite, we have your email address, and if you would prefer not to be on our mailing list, please do let us know. But if not, we will send you an email to confirm that you want to be on our mailing list, and let you know about future events. Thank you very much.